one more chance to prove it's you alone I care for. Each night I say a little prayer for just one more chance.
1931.
Just one more.
America's depression deepened.
To taste the kisses that
The Empire State Building was dedicated. The Star-Spangled Banner was officially declared the national anthem.
just one more.
Frankenstein, starring Boris Karloff, was released.
I've learned the meaning of repentance.
Wiley Post flew around the world in 8
Now you're
days.
the jury at my trial.
Thomas Edison died.
I know that I should
The University of Southern California was the college football champion. Al Capone was finally put in jail. Los Angeles was preparing for the Summer Olympics to be held the following year. Bing Crosby's Just One More Chance played on the radio.
Glad to start out. But now
And in the Los Angeles suburb of El Segundo, a baby boy was born in this house. He was the third child of Alf and Marvilla Goodwin. They named him Lyle.
we spend our lives in groping for happiness. I found it
He's my
once
father.
and tossed it aside. I've paid for it with hours of loneliness. I've nothing to hide. I'd bury my pride for just one more chance. Just one more chance.
Some other notable figures born the same year as Lyle: actors Robert Duvall, Charles Nelson Riley, James Earl Jones, Anne Bancroft, James Dean, both William Shatner and Leonard Nimoy, Leslie Caron, Martin Landau, and Regis Philbin. Authors E.L. Doctorow, Tom Wolfe and William Goldman. Sports figures Ernie Banks, Willie Shoemaker, and Mickey Mantle. World leaders Desmond Tutu and both Mikhail Gorbachev and Boris Yeltsin. Also Jim Jones, American cult leader. Alex Haley once said, "A nation's history is only the selective histories of all of its people." Lyle Goodwin's family history has some real heroes and some real characters. It includes men that were present at some of the great events in American history. The discovery of gold in California, the laying of the last spike of the Transcontinental Railroad, the Mormon migration to Utah. It also includes men who rose to the call of duty when their country needed them, in the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, World War I, World War II, and Lyle himself in the Korean War. Although Lyle was born and raised in Southern California, his roots are really in Utah, where all of his ancestors lived for several generations. Lyle comes from pioneer stock. Both his mother's and his father's families originally came to Utah as Mormon converts. Interestingly, when his parents first moved to California in 1922, they moved with Marvilla's brother and were shortly followed by Alf's parents and Harry's parents and Marvilla's parents, the Pursers, as well as her mother's parents, the Biglers. The Goodwins Pursers and Biglers all lived within several miles of each other, and often with each other. Let's take a quick look at these three branches of the family tree. James and Rebecca Purser were converted to Mormonism in their home country of Wales in 1870 in the small town of Cosheston, where he raised horses. 13 years later, upon becoming financially able, they and their 8 children boarded a train to Liverpool and emigrated to Utah on a steamship called the Nevada. 7-year-old Lewis Purser later recalled that he spent much of the 12-day trip seasick, leaning over the rail of the ship until it docked in New York City. It was the spring of 1883. Chester Arthur was President of the United States. It would be 3 years before the Statue of Liberty was erected and 9 years before Ellis Island opened. The Transcontinental Railroad had been completed for 14 years, and rail travel was quite popular. So the Purser family boarded a train in New York and headed west. The family finally arrived in Cache Valley, Utah on June 3rd, 1883, and settled in the small town of Hyde Park, near where the missionary had come from who had baptized them those many years before. Lewis Purser was only 7 when the family came to America. He worked through his youth all around the Intermountain West, including time as a cowboy in Cardston, Canada. While he was in Cardston in his late teens, he was rebaptized, as was the custom in those days. His journal recorded the event this way. It was December, and the temperature was 25 or 30 degrees below zero. The ice was 18 inches thick. A hole was cut which was large enough to baptize me. When I came out of the water, I said, "Damn, that was cold," and I was immediately immersed again. At 25 years of age, Lewis moved to Rexburg, Idaho, where he met Virginia Bigler. And after a brief courtship, they were married. They became the parents of 8 children, including Lyle's mother, Marvilla. Lyle Goodwin's great-grandfather Andrew Bigler joined the Mormon faith in Virginia during the summer of 1837, when his parents were converted. The Biglers knew the prophet Joseph Smith and were deeply involved in the early workings of the church. Andrew and his brother William Henry Bigler each served missions for the church. Andrew to Texas. William was a Mormon battalion member who later was the first to document the discovery of gold in California. His famous journal entry said, "This date, some kind of metal was found in the tail of the race that looks like gold." William Bigler was also in the original group of Mormon missionaries to land on the Hawaiian Islands. Andrew was a U.S. Army captain during the Civil War years, protecting mail routes and settlers from Indian attacks in Wyoming, Utah, and Idaho. The Biglers came west as part of the Mormon migration from Missouri to Nauvoo, Illinois, then with the pioneers to Utah. They homesteaded in Farmington for some years. Jacob Henry Bigler was 9.5 years old in 1869 when he witnessed the joining of the Transcontinental Railroad at Promontory, Utah. By 1875, the family moved to Mendon in Cache County, where they built a large rock house. Jacob Henry Bigler, who was known as Henry, grew up to be a machinist and blacksmith who lived and worked in northern Utah and southern Idaho. In 1880, he married Harriet Lemon, the daughter of Mormon pioneers. Harriet had grown up in Mendon in a log home with a dirt roof. This photograph, although not of her, was taken of a Mormon family in Utah in the 1860s, and it's typical of the kind of house Harriet would have lived in when she was born in 1860. She was only the third white child born in Mendon, and as a child her parents tied her to the porch when playing outside for fear that Indians would steal her. Henry and Harriet had 10 children over 18 years. It's interesting to note that their eldest child, Virginia, had her first child just 10 days after Harriet had her last. In the summer of 1896, the family moved to Rexburg, Idaho, where in 1899 Virginia met and was married to Lewis Purser, that same cowboy who'd been baptized in the ice twice. Virginia and Lewis Purser had 8 children together, their eldest daughter being Lyle's mother, Marvilla. Charles Clifford Goodwin was born at Stratford-on-Avon, England, in 1840. As a 21-year-old, he converted to Mormonism, and at 22, married the widow Phoebe Chambers. The Goodwins emigrated to Utah 2 years later, settling in Logan. Charles, known as C.C. Goodwin, was a devout churchman, endowed and sealed to his wife in the temple. He was the choir master of the Logan Choir. He even wrote a hymn on the occasion of a visit by Brigham Young in 1867. The hymn "Hail to Brigham Young" was sung to the prophet. "God bless our prophet, priest, and king, our leader Brigham Young," said the hymn. As it was being sung, President Young reportedly turned to the man next to him and said, "The man who wrote this hymn will apostatize," which he did. How it came about is interesting, but what happened after is even more interesting. Sometime in the late 1860s, he began to be disaffected with the church. He was expelled from the Elders' Quorum in 1870. Then on Valentine's Day 1873, C.C. apparently witnessed the lynching of the ne'er-do-well son of a prominent local family. As he gazed upon the body of the man hanging lifeless from the signboard outside the local jail, he loudly reported that he was going to call the U.S. Marshal to investigate, at which time he was told that he'd better keep his mouth shut because there was room for 3 or 4 more people to hang from that sign. As a further warning, a gang waylaid him in the streets, beat him senseless, and left him unconscious in a snowbank. He moved to Ogden and studied law, entering the bar in the early 1880s. By 1885, he was appointed United States Commissioner, and it was in this role that he struck terror into the hearts of some of Logan's prominent Mormons. His specialty was enforcing the anti-polygamy Edmunds-Tucker Act, jailing polygamists and cohabitators, and apparently proving that there's no anti-Mormon like an ex-Mormon. It's said that after a hard day on the bench, Judge Goodwin would drop in at J.R. Edwards' saloon there, on Logan's Main Street, for a little liquid relaxation. The owner of the saloon, Mr. Edwards, was more than willing to serve him, but before he did so, he always made the judge sing his hymn, and the judge always obliged. There's something endearing about the thought of a man who had just spent a hard 8 hours putting polygamists in jail, belting out a chorus of "God bless our prophet, priest, and king," while downing a shot of red-eye. Not a lot is known about C.C.'s son, Harry, Lyle's grandfather, who was born about the time of the infamous Logan beating. He was not raised in the church. Harry was mostly a farmer, but was chronically unemployed and suffered from alcoholism for many years. He and his wife had 9 children, the eldest son of which was Alfred, Lyle's father. Alfred was born in a log house, September 7th, 1896, about 20 miles outside of Logan in the small farming community of Cornish, Utah. Grover Cleveland was president. Because they lived on a farm, and because he was the eldest son, Alf was heavily involved in laboring on the farm and providing for the family when his father was out of work. The family eventually moved to Trenton, living in this house. His schooling was spotty, and in fact, he only finished the 7th grade. In 1918, as World War I raged in Europe, he enlisted in the U.S. Army and was sent to Camp Lewis, Washington. Upon returning from the war, he tried his hand at farming, but had more bad years than good, especially when he had to give a third of the crop to the man from whom he rented the land. Alf never had any religious training, but began to attend LDS services after he met his future wife, Marvilla Purser, who was active in the Mormon Church. He was baptized 2 months before marrying her on October 23, 1922. Alf was 26 years old, but was really struggling to find work in Trenton. And so it was that he picked up and headed to Southern California with Marvilla's brother, in search of steady employment. They drove a Model T, averaging about 25 miles per hour. They found work in Long Beach and sent for their wives, who joined them a month later. Alf and Marvilla lived in Long Beach for a while, Alf driving a bus for the Long Beach Transit Company. He had started work at the Standard Oil Refinery in El Segundo. So they moved with their 1-year-old son DeLon to a small house at 711 Main Street in El Segundo. It was in this house that the second and third Goodwin children were born, a daughter, Barbara, in 1926, and Lyle on April 8, 1931. When he was only 5 months old, the family of 5 packed up the car and drove to Salt Lake City, where Alf and Marvilla had their marriage sealed in the LDS temple. Alf and Marvilla Goodwin had 3 children, DeLon, known as Dee, Barbara, known as Bar, and Lyle, who was often referred to as Lyle, much to his mother's chagrin.
I remember my parents coming home and telling me they had this new baby. And what should we have this baby be, a boy or a girl? And I said I wanted it to be a girl, and Dee said he wanted it to be a boy. And of course, it was a boy already, and they knew that before they ever asked the question. So that was very distressing to me.
The mother did not like nicknames, so she tried to find a name that could not be shortened or nickname, and hence Lyle, because there's no other Lyles in the family. But that she wasn't successful because during elementary school, grade school, I was always called Ly, so even Lyle was shortened. And they have a middle initial only because Mom felt that men should have at least 2 names to differentiate them from others, but didn't believe it's necessary to have a second name, so she just gave me the initial P, which I suspect came to her in remembrance of her maiden name, Purser.
It was happy most of the time.
He was the favorite. And I remember having those discussions. Dee was the favorite because he was the oldest. He got all kinds of opportunities that we didn't get. I was the favorite because I was the girl. And he was the favorite because he was the baby. So that's how it went. But he really was the favorite.
Dee has reminded me of Alfred.
I think he's more like his dad than anybody. Barbara's like her mother, and Lyle is just there. And Lyle is just sort of got both of them. I mean, he's He's adventurous. He wants to do things.
Right.
He likes to travel.
As was their custom, the entire extended family lived within a few miles of each other in El Segundo.
Our grandparents lived just down the street. The whole family lived in El Segundo. You know, all the Pursers, all the Bigglers, everybody lived right there. When we moved, everybody moved. You know, it just seemed to me, my aunts or my uncles or somebody was always living down the street, because there was this whole passel of Goodwins and Pursers and Bigglers that were in those same areas.
My grandmother's house was there in El Segundo, and my great grandparents' house was there too. I remember Henry Bigler, my great grandfather, used to wear kind of a derby hat and would wear it most of the day, and pretty dressed up all the time too, just so that he would be ready to go with somebody somewhere. He was always ready to leave it at any invitation. And then I remember when my grandmother, great-grandmother, died there, lived in a little house. My recollection was only like 2 rooms, a bedroom and another living room, but I'm sure it had a little more than that, because I was young when she died. But it's long since disappeared. Luckily, my mother's youngest sister, Bernice, and her husband lived there in Inglewood until both of them passed on not too long before. Must have been 40 years at least in the same house there. My grandfather, Louis Purser, and he also went to work at Standard Oil in El Segundo. They both worked there quite a while. And he enjoyed fishing because it was only a couple miles from the ocean. And he had a big smoker in his backyard, I remember, where he'd catch saltwater fish and smoke them. And remember a big avocado tree in the backyard, huge avocado tree. Grandmother and grandfather Purser are both buried in the Inglewood Cemetery, as well as Mom's younger sister Bernice and her husband. I'm not sure where Virginia is, but Beth, or Bethia, her actual name, is still living today in 2004 down in Southern California.
Wow.
She's the last surviving of the sisters and brothers. That was in the late 20s that they moved to that area, but even decades later, Cache Valley, Utah was still home to them. They always kind of felt they were just temporarily in California all these decades. Utah felt like home.
Grandpa Purser owned 2 cabins at Big Bear Lake in the mountains east of L.A. Lyle has many memories of camping there, often with members of the extended family.
We always would make a halfway stop in Riverside at a special wide spot in the road that had a spring-fed drinking fountain. It was kind of almost had monument status there before you start up the windy road to Big Bear Lake. And those cabins, I don't even remember how my grandfather came upon them, but they were, without running water. There was a hand pump well on the outside, and of course the outhouse. And I remember many times sleeping with my grandfather in old, might have been down feather mattresses, because I know I kept rolling to the middle, I guess, with him, and I just remember being poked by his elbow all through the night, and he'd just keep saying, over a little, over a little, over a little. And I guess I'd keep rolling back to the center, and over a little, over a little. There's an old hand wound Victrola that was there. I remember it was without a needle, or at least without a needle part of the time I was there, and I found that if I used my fingernail, I could get some semblance of sound out of it if you put your head to it and your fingernail on the track as that was going around, which really surprised me.
Lyle lived in El Segundo for only a few years. Although the Depression was on, the family was upwardly mobile and soon moved about 10 miles northeast to Inglewood. They rented in a couple of locations, but in 1936 bought their first home, a home they would live in for the next 25 years. Although the house in Inglewood is modest by today's standards, it was quite large and was in a really prime location.
When we moved into it, it was a great house, 4-bedroom house, laundry room, breakfast room, separate single-car garage, right across the street from a major city park. The city would have its 4th of July events there, and set up fireworks at night, so all the relatives would come over and lay on our downward sloping lawn that kind of faced to where the fireworks were, so everybody can kind of lean back without having to bend their necks. We had a long driveway. The garage was at the back of the house, so that allowed a lot of off-street parking. It was a lot of fun, and then we embarked on a renovation project, put floor-to-ceiling divided light windows in the living room to kind of make it a little more contemporary. And I know 2 or 3 members of the ward who happen to be in the plastering business replastered the living room walls and did a good renovation job on it. There was a walk coming in on the low hillside and a loquat tree, which you don't hear of much anymore. It was always fun to be loquats there.
Over the years, many family pictures were taken in front of that loquat tree. During World War II, an Army division which was assigned to protect the California coast took over the park across the street for a number of months.
That was great for a young boy growing up. I'd go over and eat meals with them, and they would give me lots of their emblems, uniform emblems, and little medals you could wear. And then they would come over at the house, ostensibly to ask my mother, because the cook's tent was immediately across from us. They would come over ostensibly to ask Mom about cooking shortcuts and quantities for recipes, when it was really to see my older sister Barbara, who reverted to crawling over the backyard fence in order to go to school rather than head up the street in the mornings, because she didn't appreciate the whistles and
How old was she?
and the stairs. Well, she's 6 years older than I was, so she was probably 16, somewhere around there, that area.
Inglewood borders Los Angeles International Airport on the north. El Segundo borders it on the south. And all around the airport was, and still is, a thriving aircraft industry.
There was Douglas, Northrop, North American, and Northrop developed Flying Wing, and we used to see it flying around all the time there. It was kind of exciting. In fact, during the war there, we had frequent blackouts in the Inglewood area where you had to either drive with your lights off or tape the top part of them. I can remember on more than one occasion anti-aircraft fire, whether it was real or, well, it was real, whether it was real enemy planes or not, or whether it was for effect, I don't know, but we had that. And the park was relatively large, and we walked to town, and I walked to high school through that park. It was a big park, and I remember Mom used to walk through it at night. In those days, it was perfectly safe, or certainly more safe than it is now to do that, to be out at night in the dark. But it's a great park. Ball fields, swimming pools, picnic tables, bandstands.
Alf worked at the Standard Oil Refinery 10 miles away. He was a shift worker, meaning that every few weeks his work schedule would change from days to evenings to graveyard.
He never did sleep the same time for more than a week, so many times we wouldn't cross paths me sleeping during the days, but he was always ready, willing, and able to play catch. We did that a lot out in the yard.
Well, my dad was very interested in his sports, Lyle's sports, because he was so involved in sports, and Dad loved baseball, and I'm sure he never missed a football game. But I do remember seeing a lot of ball games in Centinela Park that Lyle participated in.
He was a halfback on the football team, Inglewood High. And Dad would go and watch the games, and he would shake all the time he was there. Sure, Lyle, it did hurt.
The park across the field allowed my school chums, we would play football, even though the field was sloping considerably downward, the sidelines being the curb on one side and a row of palm trees spaced quite a ways apart formed kind of the imaginary sideline on the other side, and we used to leapfrog over those palm trees as for fun too. Those palm trees today are probably 50 feet tall. But at that time, they were a lot of fun playing around. But
For many years, Marvilla worked as a sales clerk at the Sears store at Vermont and Slauson.
Worked in sales, and I think she'd made a great sales person. She was always very polite and sociable. I can remember one time going to pick her up with Dad and walking kind of hand in hand with Dad down the broad aisle in the Sears store, and then for some reason we parted hands, and while he looked at something and I continued on, and then reached up and grabbed the hand of some strange gentleman there who held my hand, and we continued to walk through the store, not knowing that it wasn't Dad. He was just back there laughing a little bit, but I can remember that.
The Goodwins were a working-class family, and the effects of the Depression and war years were felt every day. But they had steady work in a region of the country that was buffered from the worst of the times.
We weren't well-to-do, but
weren't hurting in any way, and certainly I never recognized any problems.
I think we had a very, very good childhood. I know when I was growing up, everybody wanted to come to our house. I don't think we realized that we didn't have very much because no one had very much. And I remember paydays vividly because I remember that's when Mother came back from the grocery store with lots of groceries. And so we usually had cold cereal or some other thing that we craved the rest of the 2 weeks. But I don't remember that we felt underprivileged in any way.
I never felt deprived of anything.
One interesting perspective on life in the Goodwin home in the 40s can be found in the letters that Marvilla wrote to her newly married daughter Barbara. Marvilla wrote at least one letter a week detailing the goings-on in Englewood. Of course, Lyle was still living at home, so many of the letters refer to his activities. Marvilla is gone now, but Barbara's voice sounds today much as Marvilla's did then.
Friday, September 27, 1946. I took Lyle and Bud over to the game, then went shopping. I sure found a lot of hard-to-get items, chicken of the sea tuna, hand-soaked navy beans, and even broke down and bought me a casserole. There still is no meat to be had, though, and rabbits have gone up to 75 cents per pound. Friday, April 4th, 1947. I sold the piano Monday for $60. Pretty good, I'd say, because we only gave $25 for it about 14 years ago. I'm going to spend every nickel of it as fast as I can. Believe me. I'm going to get me a couple of print dresses, slips, and a few other things I've been needing for too long. I told Dad and Lyle they could have a new pair of dress shoes for Dad and a jacket for Lyle out of it. Of course, they kid me about not being fair, as I should split it 3 ways.
Today, we'd never think of being able to stretch $60 to buy 2 dresses, 2 slips, a jacket, and a pair of shoes. Then again, we probably wouldn't be worried about the price of rabbit meat either. The Goodwins were always active in the LDS Church. They attended the Englewood Ward on Centinela Avenue, just a few blocks from their home.
My father was not active as far as holding positions in the church, but I know all of us kids were active. I mean, we lived very close to the church. We were able to walk to it, and we were all very active in the church.
Be in that same building in Englewood,
Yeah.
which seemed twice as small. I remember that feeling going in there as an adult, a bigger size than it was remembering as a 10 or 11-year-old or something like that. The building just changed size. It had the baptismal font without a patio, which had since been filled in with the classrooms and whatever.
The church has grown in Englewood, from a single ward in the 40s to a full stake of 9 wards today. Marvilla held positions in the primary, Sunday school, and Relief Society, and Lyle was active in his priesthood quorums. For many months, an LDS missionary lodged in their home. Both Lyle and Dee participated in the church sports program. Lyle attended Englewood High School, which is about a mile from his house. He was active in sports and student government. In fact, he was freshman class president in 1946 and a member of the Boys League his senior year. Apparently, that year, cuffed denims were popular.
I wasn't straight A grades. High school wasn't hard. I wished I'd taken auto shop. I thought that was for dummies. I didn't, but at this point in life, I wished I had.
You've paid for it.
But it was an enjoyable experience. I was probably not in the mainstream, but not too far out of it.
Were you popular?
Yeah, but I say it wasn't the life of the party or that type of thing as far as the school's concerned. But was popular primarily because of athletics, and they seemed to always have a measure of popularity in school, things like.
On a Sunday afternoon, soon after his 16th birthday, Lyle was laying on the floor in the living room of the Inglewood house when a light airplane crashed near their house. He popped up and ran over to where the plane had crashed, barely 100 feet from the Goodwin home.
I used to listen to USC basketball games and keep score on a score pad on the floor. Free throws and points scored. Anyway, just happened to be looking over my shoulder as I laid on the floor there and saw the little plane go down in the windows.
His mother recorded the event this way.
Wednesday, April 29, 1947. We had quite a bit of excitement around here Sunday afternoon. A small plane crashed right out in the street in front of Harm's house. There were 3 young fellows in it, and they had been circling around over this area several times, flying real low. It hit the trees in front of Harm's place and landed in the street. About 2 minutes after it landed, the gas tank exploded and the plane burst into flames. Lyle was sitting on the floor in the front room, listening to the radio, and seeing it start down over Harm's place. And when it crashed, our house just cracked. Lyle knew what had happened and was up and out of the house and around the corner before I even knew what had happened, and the flames were shooting way above Harm's house. How the fellows ever got out of it alive, I'll never understand. They were still sitting in the plane, Lyle said, when he got there, and the few others who had gathered yelled at them to get out before it burst into flames.
The 22-year-old unlicensed student pilot and passengers had escaped the wreckage with only minor cuts and bruises. Lyle loved sports. He played baseball, softball, basketball, and football, and seems to have been equally adept at each. Sometimes he played several sports at the same time. Sophomore year, he played B football and JV baseball. Junior year, he was catcher on the varsity baseball team. And senior year, he played both varsity baseball and varsity football.
I was called an Iron Man, the football team, because I went both ways, played both offense and defense. One of the rewarding things was being voted the most valuable player on the football team the last year. Jim Sears was voted most valuable offensive. Jim Sears, who played the other halfback, was more outstanding. He received a scholarship to go to USC and play football, which he did. I remember we'd go out together to register, and we'd go through the line to pay the tuition, and they'd stamp his paid, and I'd have to suck out Mom and Dad's hard-earned money there to pay the price at USC.
During the summer of 1948, Lyle's parents thought it might be fun for him to spend the summer out in Cleveland, Ohio with Barbara and Ken, where Ken was competing in the national air races.
And I was a senior in high school, and went back there to visit with him for the summer and help him prepare his P-51. It wasn't his, but the one he was the pilot, P-51 Mustang in the national air races at that time. And that was a really exciting summer for a teenager to do that, being in around the airport and listening in to conversations with a bunch of pilots and taking test runs in a couple of different airplanes. One of the pilots in the race had an Avion, and he took us, Ken and myself, up in that Navion to fly the course, which is defined by big pylons, and was leisurely flying along, and he says, words to the effect that I will have to take these pylons like this, I guess, and turned it up on edge and used just the tail ailerons to make the 90-degree turn, it felt like. And that's the first time I'd ever experienced pulling G's, force of gravity, which felt like somebody was going to tear the skin off your face, and all your insides were pushing down on the seat. And it was a real surprise, especially for me. They both experienced it many times, but also watched a plane go in, as they say, in a direct straight down crash before the races, of which the pilot had ejected. So it broke his leg when he hit the tail in that type of descent.
As exciting as the air races were, they were nowhere near as exciting as the trip home would be. Ken, who eventually took second place, arranged with a couple of his friends in the air freight business to shuttle Lyle home on their next flight west. So Ken drove Lyle to Dayton, where he boarded a DC-3 freighter that was loaded with Chevrolet dashboards on their way to an assembly plant in Oakland, California.
En route, we went to Kansas City, Missouri, where they paid for my lodging overnight in Kansas City, and refueled the old DC-3, which is a two-engine prop plane, an old World War II workhorse. And it turned out that they refueled, they filled up the remaining auxiliary tanks with the proper octane, then filled the previously empty main tanks with the improper octane. And when we flew out the following morning on the auxiliary tanks that were a mixture, things went fine until we got over the Midwest and was starting to lose power in one engine, which we eventually lost. And I didn't know a lot of this was going on because I was sitting behind the co-pilot, back to the front, facing back to the door that separated the pilot's compartment from the cargo. But I sensed something was wrong when I heard all this pumping and pumping and pumping, and noticed the pilot sweating profusely from on his back shirt, and pointing out that they would keep losing the red light on the emergency landing field we were trying to reach in Rock Springs, Wyoming, because it would go behind mountains.
The pilot turned around and yelled to Lyle to open the rear hatch and jettison the dashboard so that they could keep altitude.
I got up, started to undo his little seat belts, my strap there, and he changed his mind.
Repairs were made in Rock Springs, and 2 days later, the plane, Lyle, and the dashboards continued on to Oakland.
Dropped the cargo off in Oakland, continued down to Oxnard, south to Oxnard, California, where the freight company was stationed. And then I drove with the pilot who lived in Eagle Rock on the outskirts of Los Angeles, where I caught a streetcar for 10 cents and took it to a home in Inglewood. So I made it from Cleveland to Inglewood on a dime. And I remember that vivid, exciting experience as a 17-year-old.
Lyle's Inglewood High School football teammate Jim Hayes had a girlfriend, Gloria Swanson, whose father owned a mobile home resort in Malibu called Paradise Cove. During a big storm, a fishing boat broke its moorings and was beached at Paradise Cove. They saw the boat and thought it would be really cool to own a commercial fishing vessel. And the owner of the boat told them that they could have it if they would just remove it.
So we took about to do that and rented a big trailer and a bulldozer to try to move it in. And in moving it, the hundreds and hundreds of pounds of wet sand that had collected in the keel. It was an old wooden boat on which, like a tongue and groove boat, where they caulk all the joints between the woods with cotton and seal it and whatever. But anyway, we did get it up by a crane and onto a trailer, and I still have it was called the Rough Sea, letter C. And I still have the compass and the bill that salvaged off that ship. And we got it on the trailer, hauled it to Jim Hayes' house down in Inglewood, and parked it next to a garage in his house. And we never did get at it, not knowing anything about repairing them. The last I saw or heard of it, it was leaning on the garage, threatening to knock the garage down, and I don't know whatever happened to the ship anyway, but that was our brief adventure in ship owning as seniors in high school. Anyway, this is the bell, and a good bell it is, and the compass off of the Rough Sea, still an operating compass this time with the floating directions in there. And these are the only two things that I believe that remain from the ship. It was Sam's engine anyway, so it never became a seaworthy object again.
Lyle's girlfriend in high school was Nancy May. He doesn't remember exactly how they met, but she was a regular at a Christian youth group that several of Lyle's friends attended.
Nancy, last name May, was a pretty popular girl in high school. Somewhat athletic, played on the girls' field hockey teams and tennis teams. Was kind of active in the administration part. That's not what you call it, but she wasn't class president or anything like that, but very part of the in-group. And I say I really don't remember the first time. She's very good looking, beautiful gal.
Nancy was vivacious and outgoing. They went to prom together and were high school sweethearts. After graduating high school, Lyle applied to the University of Southern California School of Architecture.
I'd always, since freshman year of high school, thought about getting into architecture. Took the drafting courses and mechanical drawing courses in high school, enjoyed those.
Unfortunately, he couldn't get in for a year due to a long waiting list, so in the interim, he attended El Camino Junior College with several of his friends.
I played on El Camino's baseball team. Down there, I was a catcher in high school, but in El Camino played shortstop and really enjoyed that, and got to enjoy the game a little bit more than I did understand a little bit more baseball in high school. But it was a fun year, and really enjoyed still hanging out, so to speak, with some of the guys and at the same school, and then went to USC the following year.
He started in the USC architecture program in 1951.
Found the first year of in-school architecture tough. It's one of those, it's a 5-year course. The first year they call it basic design, and it's one of those designed to weed out a lot of people right off the bat. And so it did a lot of things that I didn't expect or understand. Doing a wood sculpture, I remember was doing a wood sculpture that would balance on 1 point and or 2 points. Either one, or had to do both. It would balance on 1 point as well as balance on 2 points. I'm not sure I understood the rationale for that. One time I remember one of my projects I had to get a chicken's foot because I had to demonstrate some structural reasons why feet and limbs and things work, and I remember getting the chicken's foot from a butcher and pulling the tendons that rang up the leg that controlled all the claws on it.
Ultimately, the Korean War would interrupt his schooling. Lyle completed 2.5 years at USC before enlisting in the U.S. Air Force. High school sweethearts Lyle and Nancy May were deeply in love and continued seeing each other beyond high school.
I was much enamored of Nancy, so much so that when the time called for a mission, I declined the call because I was in love at that time.
They set a wedding date of September 1951.
Nancy was a Catholic. She was a pretty devout Catholic. She attended, I think her dad was too, but I don't think he attended church, but she was. And so I went so far as to, prior to the marriage, to take the Catholic lessons, because that was going to be a prerequisite to getting married.
Lyle was 20 years old. On their wedding day, he wore a blue blazer with matching tie, tan slacks, and brown Oxfords. She wore a beautiful tea-length chiffon dress with cap sleeves. Her delicate rosebud headband matched the bouquet. These images really show how happy they were.
So you can think of this journey as a walk down memory lane. See the rough times that lead you to the right times that make it worth all the pain. You hear yourself start to pray at the end of every day. In your heart, you feel a change. Now the wind still blows the strongest tree. The same wind will carry me. When I set my fears aside, there's still a voice inside. When the storms are gone, the sun will find me.
They rented an apartment in Inglewood. Lyle was going to school, and they both worked at a local restaurant. One night at the restaurant, just before closing, an incident occurred that Lyle has never forgotten.
I was working sometimes as a fry cook, but and later on I was the night manager at the Yum Burger shop.
We made yum burgers. It was run by the bishop. It did a good business, and this was not too much before Christmas. And there was a vacant lot directly across Manchester Boulevard selling Christmas trees. And then one night, we closed at 2 in the morning. And one night, guy came in the back door wearing a top coat. And to tell you the truth, I can't recall whether I was up front. I don't think so. I was in the kitchen at the time. And he came in and had a pistol between the buttons, his buttoned overcoat, and had a pistol barrel sticking through between the two buttons in the middle, and just marched me up to the front where the cash register was, and there were still people in the restaurant, and asked me to take the money out of the cash register and walk back with me. Nobody really noticed much at all. We went back into the kitchen, and he then wanted money out of the safe in the little office, the floor safe in the little office. But I told him I didn't have access to it, which I don't believe I did, a combination to it. And he bought that anyway, and then left out the back door. And so it was reported to the police. As soon as he went out the back door, I had visions of a series of karate chops to his neck and a knee to the groin and a lot of other things. But at the time, I felt very subdued looking at the barrel. But then it was reported to the police, and a few days, well, it was only a day or two later, I went down to the Los Angeles Police Department and went through their mug books. They have just rooms full of burglars, rooms full of armed robbers, categorized all of these by the crimes they've committed. And there's 12 photos to a page, a front and a side of 6 different people on each page, and big notebooks. And so I leafed through there to see if I could identify this person, and I saw Michael D'Amico. I remember his name now, apostrophe A-M-I-C-O, Michael D'Amico in there, happened to be his name. And I can remember just, seeing that face here, it hits you right in the stomach, something like that when you do it. And so a alert went out for him, and it turns out that just the night before, which was a couple of nights after this holdup, he was arrested along with a girl and another accomplice in Santa Monica for holding up a motel. So the police took me over to the Santa Monica police, where Michael was in a police lineup, and to pick him out of the lineup. I can remember also the eerie feeling of lived in a little apartment at that time where the garage comes off a back alley to service the apartments, and I can distinctly remember the feelings I had after that holdup of meeting Michael in the garage or in the alley or something there, stalking me at the house or something, which never did happen, and I'm sure it wouldn't have.
The Korean War was on during Lyle's time at USC. Although he was married, he was likely to be drafted, so to avoid being drafted into the Army, he enlisted with the United States Air Force.
The ROTC, Reserve Officer Training Corps, requirements for or allotment for numbers that could be in that group were reduced, and by the time the university had included the first 2 or 3 strings of the football team and the baseball team and the basketball team and those more important people in it, there was no room, more room in the ROTC for that. So rather than being drafted into the Army, which I chose not to be, I enlisted in the Air Force for a 4-year enlistment during the Korean War.
He spent his first 2 years at Mather Air Force Base near Sacramento working in engineering. While stationed in Sacramento, Lyle learned that his wife Nancy was having an affair.
the two fry cooks opened another restaurant themselves, and Nancy went to work for them as a cashier. And she was being wooed by a Los Angeles police officer, motorcycle officer, who frequented the restaurant where she was working as a cashier and would take the place next to the cash register, and anyway, wooed her.
They tried to patch things up. They rented an apartment in Sacramento, and Nancy moved up for a brief period. But unfortunately, the marriage did not last. Lyle filed for divorce after just 2 years of marriage.
At the last high school reunion we attended with Leslie, which was it's a combined reunion between the class of 48 and the class of 49, and it must have been the 50 year, in 99 I guess it was. Nancy was there, and she got up to go to the ladies' restroom or something, and said, Leslie says, I want to talk with her. And she got up and went in there and spoke with her. And they both came out together and sat at the table for a little bit. And Leslie says, I really like her.
Lyle had always admired Mexican architecture, the textures and colors and so on, and contemplated going to the architecture school at the University of Mexico in Mexico City. While stationed in Sacramento in the Air Force, he had some leave time, as did his best friend Phil Barnhart. So he and Phil decided to drive down to Mexico City to check it out.
Borrachita de tequila llevo siempre el alma mía. Para ver si se mejora esta cruel melancolía.
We pondered how heavily to become harmed for all the stories we heard at that time about highway robbers in Mexico, and how the condition of the roads and what have you, but we decided it was probably safest not to take a gun, neither one of us, to my knowledge, owning one. I certainly didn't. So we departed and went down and crossed the border, I guess it was Nogales, into first major town, Monterrey, Mexico, but there was a border check station before we ever got into Monterrey to check paperwork, which made us think again about being armed, in as much as it looked like about a 1910 or 20s abandoned gas station with maybe a 40-watt bulb hanging from a bare wire out in front. A couple of Mexicans wearing brown overcoats, carrying rifles. They weren't matching overcoats, just brown overcoats. And inside, on the dirt floor of the station proper itself, was a single table and like 2 chairs and a couple of pieces of paper on it, and an old dog sleeping on the floor. And we thought this was maybe the last time we might see home. But they just looked at the papers and mumbled something unintelligible to us. Neither one of us spoke Spanish, although we had practiced a little bit before going down there. And they sent us on our way. Took a lot of photos down there of interesting buildings done by prominent and well-known architects, international architects from Mexico, but concluded that the language barrier might be more than they could handle in a technical field, having a language problem in addition.
As it turned out, the language problem Lyle worried about would become a problem a lot sooner than he thought. Lyle Lyle and Phil both enjoyed music, especially at the time, Latin music. They'd listened to it a lot back in high school, and since they were in Mexico City for a week, they decided to go in search of some good Latin jazz at one of the many nightclubs there.
And so we went to what was called the Medio de Noche, middle of the night clubs, listening to music, and we, in our broken Spanish, at one place asked where we could listen to some more live music. And I remember using that word, medio de noche, to kind of explain what we're trying to, it's one of the few things we knew, what we wanted. And he said, come, or called a taxi. And the taxi picked us up and took us to what's called the Chapultepec Park area of Mexico City, which is a very exclusive area with streets lined with mansions, big trees, statuary, roundabouts with little parks in them and whatever. We didn't see all that much of it because it was dark late, but it was a very exclusive area. He got out, taxi driver got out and went to one of these mansions, knocked on the door, and the slot opened up, as you've seen in many movies. And then the door opened up and we were invited in, and there was a couple of guitar players, and a violinist playing, Christmas tree, but we quickly found out that it was actually a house of ill repute. I guess a high-class house of ill repute, because the person who seemed to be in charge was wearing a tuxedo, the male in charge, like a tuxedo. And it wasn't long before we were being approached by young ladies, as I recall, a couple dressed in satin, you know, shiny satin, looked like homemade, bright-colored dresses. It was late, and so we asked the fella in the tuxedo to get a cab to go home, and we didn't get much immediate attention. We thought he was maybe working on it, but nothing happened for, I don't remember, half an hour or something like that even, while the same series of events is taking place. And then finally he came over and said, again in kind of broken English, got to ride with somebody named Mother, who will be picking her up. And apparently lives close to where we had mentioned the Reforma Hotel where we stayed. And so after maybe a half an hour, which I think was like 2 o'clock in the morning or something like that, Mother shows up, and so we were both taken home by the mother and her working daughter, and dropped us both off at the hotel there.
Lo perdí.
Lyle was transferred to Elmendorf Air Force Base in Alaska, where he drafted plans for targets and mapped facilities at military bases in Alaska in case of Russian takeover.
One of our summer exercises up there, as the weather allowed in summer, was to go out 2 by 2 in Alaskan skin boats with 2 Eskimo hosts. The skin boats were actually made from whalebone and driftwood and covered with walrus hide, and we would go out and go up the western coast of Alaska, and a couple of people would get out and walk the coast looking for flotsam and jetsam, debris washed ashore from the shipping lanes up in that area, and then the boat would go up and drop off 2 others and wait for the first 2 to arrive up there in this leapfrog fashion. And then we would send everything collected back to headquarters at Wright-Patterson, and there they would try to make determinations from the labels of the shipping debris and that type of thing, what shipments were taking place in that area up there. That was kind of a summer activity. But I don't remember ever questioning whether they're being put to good use or not, nor
did I ever find out whether any important information had been derived and was of much value. That didn't seem important, that we were assigned some work to do, and we did the work and went on the next day.
So you found stuff
We did find things.
with Russian words on it or whatever, and
Uh-huh.
labels or cans or bottles.
Crates.
Oh, really? Like crates
Pieces of
full
wood
of actual
crates.
stuff?
No,
Or just broken up?
no, just broken up and stuff that had probably been dumped overboard or something of that nature by shipping crews up there. But mostly we found a bunch of old weather-worn driftwood that had been probably going in and out with the tide for decades.
Several of his friends also served in the military at that time. Good friend Phil Barnhart went into the Navy. Mel Moore, who played first base on Lyle's high school baseball team, and Clarence Strickland, who was a halfback on the football team, both served, Mel in the Army and Clarence in the Marines.
And Mel was killed in Korea. I don't know the circumstance of his death. And Clarence was shot by one of his Marine Corps buddies there accidentally and suffered a spinal column injury and had paraplegic result. And was able to visit him after he returned from Korea in the Naval Hospital in Long Beach. And Clarence wasn't doing too good then, either physically or emotionally. That Clarence was a very strong, well-built, athletic guy, and anyway, we lost two friends.
Yeah.
Not immediate military associates of mine, but high school associates that went in the military after graduation.